This is BBC World News. I'm Nancy Kachingira. Our top stories. Thousands of supporters of the former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, have stormed the country's National Congress in Brasilia. President Lula, who's currently out of the capital, said everyone involved in the riots will be found and punished. World leaders have condemned the storming, with France offering the Brazilian leader their unwavering support. President Biden has arrived in Texas to visit the U.S. border with Mexico for the first time since taking office. There have been emotional reunions at airports in China after the country fully reopened its borders for the first time since the start of the pandemic nearly 3 years ago. And Britain's Prince Harry says he never intended to hurt his father or brother by writing a memoir, and talks about his mother's funeral.
The decision was made for both of us to walk behind our mother's coffin, and there's absolutely no way that I would let him do that by himself, and there's absolutely no way that he would let me do that by myself. If it was role reversal.
Hello, thank you for joining us on BBC World News. Thousands of supporters of the former Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, have stormed the country's National Congress in Brasilia. In scenes reminiscent of the attack on the U.S. Congress in Washington 2 years ago, demonstrators wrapped in the Brazilian flag quickly overwhelmed police and entered the complex. Some reached the Senate chamber, where they jumped onto seats and desks. Protesters have also invaded the presidential palace and Supreme Court. Mr. Bolsonaro lost the October election to the socialist Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who was sworn in last week. Mr. Bolsonaro's supporters have been calling for military intervention and the resignation of Mr. da Silva. In the past hour, the Brazilian president, who is in Sao Paulo, has condemned the invasion by what he called fascist fanatics. Here's more of what Mr. Lula said.
Nós achamos que houve falta de segurança.
We think there was a lack of security, and I wanted to tell you that all those people who did this will be found and punished. They will realise that democracy guarantees the right to freedom and free speech, but it also demands that people respect the institutions created to strengthen democracy.
Let's take a closer look now at where this is happening. Bolsonaro's supporters are in Brazil's capital, Brasilia. Demonstrators overwhelmed police and entered the National Congress complex. Other protesters have invaded the presidential palace, the Supreme Court, and some ministry buildings. Senior politicians in Brazil have denounced the actions of Bolsonaro's supporters. The Brazilian Senator Randolph Rodrigues tweeted saying, "The National Congress is now being attacked by terrorists. Anti-democratic criminals cannot walk freely. There's nothing to tolerate with the intolerant. We expect the harsh application of the law to all those involved in these actions." The president of Brazil's National Congress, Rodrigo Pacheco, said the security forces of the federal district, in addition to the legislative police of Congress, are committed to the action. I vehemently reject these anti-democratic acts, which must urgently undergo the rigour of the law. We also heard from the governor of Brasilia's federal district, Ibanez Rocha, who said on Twitter, "I'm in Brasilia, monitoring the demonstrations and taking all measures to contain the anti-democratic riot." And Brazil's Minister of Planning, Simone Tebet, who serves in Lula's cabinet, said, "Our federal constitution supports our ministers of justice and defence in the use of all rigorous and legitimate means for the defence of order, society and democracy. Democracy forever." Well, those are some of the responses that came in. Earlier, I spoke to our South America correspondent, Katie Watson, and she walked us through the events of today.
Well, a lot of the scenes that we have been seeing coming out of Brasilia are very reminiscent of what we saw on January the 6th in the US Capitol. Jair Bolsonaro is a man whose nickname is Trump of the Tropics. This, for many people, is seen as straight out of the Trump playbook. There were scenes of the crowds pulling off a mounted policeman off his horse, windows and doors being broken to access Congress, tear gas being fired. I mean, it is scenes of chaos and scenes that many people feared would happen ever since Lula won at the elections in October, but yet never actually came to pass. And I think that's what is so worrying about the events we have seen. We saw, it was just a week ago, Lula was sworn in, and at that point there were supporters, hardline supporters of Jair Bolsonaro who were cleared away from the centre of Brasilia, and it was an event that passed off without, in peace, without any aggression or any confrontation. And perhaps there was a feeling that issue, although was still latent, had in terms of something more severe, had gone away. But clearly, what we're seeing now, those people are back. Those people are back with a vengeance. And this is something that we're seeing in Brasilia. But you have to remember that ever since the elections in October, there have been far-right supporters of Jair Bolsonaro who have been camped out in military barracks across the country. So this is not just something that we have seen in Brasilia of the supporters, and people who are very anti-Lula coming back to power have been across the country, not just in the capital.
Yes, an important point that you make there, that it was a very close election in the end. But we just heard from President da Silva. He has introduced what he calls a federal intervention. He was speaking at a press conference a short while ago. He's just finished, I understand. Do we know what that means, what that looks like?
I know very little, apart from I think it's going to extend for the whole of the month of January. I mean, he's actually out of the capital. He's on an official visit here in Sao Paulo state. But clearly, there have been dramatic measures that need to be introduced. This is something that I think is what's worth pointing out is this is not just about people who are angry that Jair Bolsonaro lost. They are angry that Lula won. Yes, it was a very close race. Lula won just over half the vote, so half of the people who voted wanted Lula. Just under half of those people who voted did not want Lula back in any way. They see him as a corrupt politician who has spent time in jail. Those charges have been annulled, but that is not something that will convince the people who do not want to see him. They want to see him back in prison, not in the presidential palace. And it's a strong, they're strong supporters, strong protesters, sorry, who he has to contend with. And that is just what we're seeing in Brasilia, shows the deep divide here in Brazil and the huge challenge that Lula has to try and, win these people over and prove that he is a leader and a leader to everybody. And I think that's going to be the ultimate challenge for Lula, because this is such a divided country.
Oh, is that Katie Watson bringing us that useful context earlier from Sao Paulo? A short time ago, I spoke to journalist Ewan Marshall, also in Sao Paulo. He's the editor of the Brazilian Report, and he told me while today's events on a Sunday, when many of the government buildings are empty, did come as a surprise, they were not entirely unexpected.
The idea of some sort of, violent storming of government buildings in Brasilia has been on the cards for quite a while now. There have been open threats made by pro-Bolsonaro activists that they would want to do exactly that, which means that it adds to the surprise for today in terms of the police presence that we saw in the capital, Brasilia. Just really didn't seem to be a police presence of a capital that potentially expected something like this to happen. We saw hardly any law enforcement on the street. The police barricades were easily overthrown by these Bolsonaro supporters, and it's just a bit of a mess just now in the capital.
And what's your sense of why this is happening now? I mean, this is a week after the new president has been sworn in.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, the comparisons with the January 6th Capitol riots in the US are obviously there, but this is hugely different. I mean, there is no direct objective to try to stop Lula from taking power, because he already has taken power. And also today is a Sunday, and Congress and the Supreme Court are all in recess at the moment, so they're not working. The buildings are largely empty. So, there's it's the motivation of this kind of attack is quite strange, especially considering the negative repercussion that this is going to have, not only in Brazil, but around the world, I think.
And Jair Bolsonaro, I understand, is in Florida. I mean, what role is he playing in all of this? Have we heard anything from him?
Well, since the election at the end of October, when Bolsonaro lost to Lula by a razor-thin margin, Bolsonaro has remained quite quiet about the election results. He hasn't officially even conceded the election result, but at the same time, he's tried to maintain some sort of distance from the pro-Bolsonaro protesters that have been on the street and the ones storming the government buildings today. He hasn't outright kind of endorsed their actions. He's made some gestures towards them. He's supporting them implicitly, but he hasn't taken a really active role in this. I mean, assumingly because these are anti-democratic protests, and if he does, he could face criminal responsibility.
I mean, some people watching might see some comparisons there with how President Trump handled the storming of the Congress. I just wonder what you make of how these events are unfolding and how you think the government will respond. We've obviously heard from President Lula talking there about bringing in some measures to respond to this. But what do you think might happen next?
Well, it's interesting because we've heard from some Bolsonaro allies, or at least kind of previous Bolsonaro allies, that this does not represent them. The protests today are not what they have in mind. And it might actually offer quite a good opportunity for Lula as an incoming president. He can basically have all of the parties in Congress together condemning what happened today and potentially banding around behind him and giving him some support for the start of his term. I don't think this looks good at all for the Bolsonaro supporters, or especially the Bolsonaro supporters involved in today's events. There's likely to be major criminal repercussions for them. And yeah, it could even work in Lula's favour, but that's what we're going to have to see over the next days and weeks, because things are still moving very fast here at the moment.
Yes, things are certainly still moving very fast. But looking at some of the pictures that you have seen of what's been happening, I mean, is there a sense that this was organised? Because we've heard some people tell us on this programme that there were suggestions that something like this could happen. How well organised does this protest or this movement actually seem?
Well, one interesting piece of information is that over 100 coaches carrying Bolsonaro supporters arrived in Brasilia this weekend. So, that's already showing a kind of a sense of organisation, that there was going to be some sort of large-scale protest. I think the actual storming of these buildings took a lot of people by surprise, but the way that these things are orchestrated is usually by kind of instant messaging apps. You've got lots of these disparate little groups who kind of orchestrate and organise these protests, so it's quite hard to keep up with and know exactly who is behind it. But I'm sure all of that will be investigated in the coming weeks and months, because this has just caused such a massive scandal in Brazil, and something has to be done.
Ewan Marshall is editor of the Brazilian Report. Well, reaction to those events has been coming in from the United States, which recently marked the second anniversary of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. President Biden has called the situation in Brazil outrageous, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken tweeted, "Using violence to attack democratic institutions is always unacceptable," and he expressed support for President Lula da Silva. Joining me now from Washington is our correspondent, David Willis. David, it seems like this is something the United States definitely had to respond to.
Very much so, Nancy, and President Biden, as we've been hearing, has arrived in the last hour or so in El Paso, Texas. He's been attempting to deal with the situation down there on the border, a completely different topic, but he expressed his concern. He said that what is happening there is outrageous. Meanwhile, his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, told reporters via Twitter that the president is being briefed on the situation in Brasilia and in Brazil in general. And he said the United States condemns any effort to undermine democracy in Brazil. President Biden is following the situation closely. Our support for Brazil's democratic institutions is unwavering. From the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Bob Menendez, he's tweeted a statement saying that the committee condemns what they call this outrageous assault on Brazil's government buildings, incited by demagogue Bolsonaro's reckless disregard for democratic principles. And we've also had some strong reaction from Europe, from the EU, from Charles, so sorry, that's the wrong piece of paper, from the European Council President, Charles Michel, who wrote on Twitter pledging his full support for President Lula and the democratically elected government there, and support as well from President Macron of France and from the President of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, who has called on the region to unite against what he called anti-democratic mob attacks in Brazil. So you get the impression there that there is a lot, universal condemnation from several continents for what is going down in Brazil at the moment.
So rounded condemnation from all parts of the world. But of course, there is particular focus on the United States' response to this because of what happened in January 6th, which many people are calling this event in Brazil almost a copycat move. In terms of the reaction there in the United States, is that bipartisan?
Yes, I think it's going to be. And of course, you're absolutely right, Nancy. There are eerie parallels to the events of just over 2 years ago here when we saw that insurrection, that deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building, which claimed the lives of about 5 people on the day or the days thereafter. And of course, it's been something that was marked just a few days ago by President Biden when he gave out medals, some of them awarded posthumously to people who were caught up in the attacks on that day. And a very solemn ceremony took place at the White House to commemorate that second anniversary. But the parallels are quite striking, from the tear gas to somebody taking their seat in an official's chair there, to the damage that's being caused to the buildings there. And of course, there are parallels politically, because Jair Bolsonaro is was a far-right president. He was an ally of Donald Trump's, and there was the nickname conjured up, of course, that he was the Trump of the tropics. But we also know that several Trump advisors, including Steve Bannon and Jason Miller, have been advising Jair Bolsonaro in recent days and weeks.
So some pretty strong connections there between the two. Thank you very much, David Willis, joining us from Washington, D.C. Prince Harry has said he